Thank you all for those very thought-provoking comments. I'd just like to throw out a question myself and then open this distinguished panel to you to ask some questions. So I'm just thinking a little bit about the really interesting information that we heard down the line, starting at the bigger picture of Massachusetts and then talking more about misdemeanors. And I'm wondering to ask the three of you to reflect about the different challenges that serious felony cases and misdemeanor cases offer us, and whether different kinds of solutions are in the offing. So, we often hear and think that the biggest issues for public defenders in general are things about caseloads, standards, and adequate resources. Are those things more important at the at some levels than at others? Should at the misdemeanor level, should we be focusing mostly on decriminalization, which Bob talked about, or on bail hearings, which are one of the things that have sort of escaped law, if you will, and haven't yet been recognized as foundational lawyering opportunities? Should that be the focus of misdemeanor reform, and as opposed to sort of the more traditional standards, because I think Sasha suggests that standards may not be the best, saying that, you've got to have training in this and training in that may not be the best way to improve the outcomes in misdemeanor courts. Should we have a two-pronged approach, or do we try to fix everything for everyone all the way down? So I want to ask you to reflect a little bit about whether we should have different approaches, different prioritization of reforms at different levels of court.
I'll try and at least begin that conversation. I think that does raise an interesting issue. You have to push for increased funding as much as you can, but I think at the same time, there has to be some acknowledgement that increased funding may not come. And I think it requires, and this may be easy for Massachusetts to say because we're in a relatively good place indigent defense-wise, it may force you to look at what the priorities should be. And traditionally, more of the money goes to adult representation in more serious felony cases. Should more resources go to represent juveniles, for instance, where you could argue that you can make more of a difference by tackling some of the issues that juveniles face, and if you're able to, if not divert them from the criminal justice system, help them with whatever issue led to them being involved in the criminal justice system, whether it's educational issues or issues at home, and so do you put more of your resources there, hoping that it pays dividends down the road?
Well, I definitely think that we have to be aware of the political and funding constraints that we're in, and that's why I push so hard on diversion of suspended license cases, because almost everybody realizes that if you get your license suspended because you didn't have enough money to pay a ticket, that's not a risk to public safety, and so you can very often get folks to agree to take those cases out of the system. And in some places, it's between 20 and 40% of all the misdemeanor cases. So you're talking about, in Washington State, getting rid of 100,000 cases a year just in our state. That being said, in terms of what do we do about allocating resources, Anthony is absolutely right. If you neglect the kids, they're going to become adult offenders, and so you've got to put resources into representing them. And I think increasingly there's a recognition around the country that it's a specialization representing kids, and you have to have adequate resources to do that. I am very concerned about the acceptance in public defense of the word triage. Because it's really not a lawyer term. It's a battlefield, emergency room term. And when I think about triage, I think about on the battlefield trying to decide, well, this person's going to die no matter what we do, so we're not going to do anything for this person. This person will be okay no matter what we do, so we're not going to do much for this person. This person we can actually save and make a real difference, so we're going to put efforts there. That's not how lawyers should be looking at their clients, but that's how they do. I've been working in a case in New York where the public defender in one of these counties has a written policy that we exercise triage in our misdemeanor courts. And that's not acceptable. And so my sense is that we have to try to get as many cases out of the system as we can by reclassification and diversion and having felonies treated as misdemeanors, misdemeanors treated as non-criminal. But for the ones that are left, whether it's a capital case or a shoplifting case, if it's important enough to prosecute, it's important enough to defend. And that means the defense has to be adequate, more than adequate, but at a minimum adequate. And I think, as we've been pushing in Washington, the quality representation, and that's what the ABA said many years ago. Sasha's point about the structural problems of representing people in misdemeanor courts, those points are quite real. And I think Carol's question about bail, what I think is happening, and just in the last couple of years, an increasing recognition by state courts that representation at the very first appearance is critical in helping people get released on bail or a recognizance. And we've had that in Washington by court rule, but not all the courts have been providing counsel for those hearings. But now you have Maryland by interpretation of its state constitution saying there's a right to counsel at bail hearings. You have New Hampshire saying that. Arguably, the Supreme Court has halfway said that in Rothkari. And I think increasingly we can push for that. But I think it's really important to think about Sasha's points about how do we address, if people are in jail for 2 months, they're going to plead guilty to get out of jail. And the lawyers can't do a whole lot about that except get them out of jail and get the case dismissed somehow.
Sasha, you want to add something?
I just, I'd second Bob's reluctance to use the word triage. The problem is not that we underfund the defense bar. The problem is that we have a massive unfair criminal justice system that sweeps in poor people and people of color, and that after Gideon, somehow this has become a problem that defense lawyers are supposed to solve on our own. So I think two ways of rethinking the problem are useful. One is to stop thinking of Gideon as a magic bullet, as if prosecutors and courts and politicians and society have no ethical and moral responsibility to criminal defendants. And then second, to appreciate how powerful misdemeanor reform can be. Misdemeanors, I think, have been sort of the neglected stepchildren in the criminal justice debate and the academy because they're, petty. Although I'm going to get a T-shirt that says "Petty is the new big," because I think that understanding that this is the gateway into the criminal system, not just for defendants but for lawyers. Many of us were trained in the misdemeanor system. It's the gateway for law enforcement. It is many ways a tone-setting arena in which the things that we accept there work their way up into more serious cases. So I think it's not a triage question. It's not an either or. It's appreciating the challenges that we have at every level of the criminal system and asking how those different arenas can open up opportunities for change.
That's great. Well, if you're thinking about language, you may not want to call them stepchildren. Like numerically, they're like entire orphanages, So does anyone, do we have any questions from this audience? Yes, sir.
Mr. Benedetti, how have the changes in marijuana laws for Massachusetts changed the caseload in your office?
I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but when we first took a look at the caseload, once the law went into effect, there was definitely a drop in the number of cases that we had of individuals charged with marijuana. So that's an example where decriminalizing an offense leads to a small change in terms of resource allocation.
Hi.
Hi.
I just want to thank you, first of all, for letting me know that you were going to have this discussion today, because I go into the courts a lot, working with people, young people, old people, and I see urban law, that's what it is. In our community, we have a subculture of drugs in our community. We have a lot of drug arrests. And there's a pattern that the police officer uses that disallows the defendant from being able to challenge him when it comes to like a motion to suppress. You can go to several courts in the city of Boston and you find this. So I'm just thinking that maybe, that we could look at the way that police officers arrest people, stop and frisk, you're doing something around that. But I just think that with the public defender's office advocating the way that they do, I would ask, if you ever think about just looking at the approach. So many young people are going to jail through the misdemeanor system, and the probation department is a part of that. I'm wondering if we have enough public defenders on Wednesdays in Roxbury Court for probation surrender. And they can be surrendered because they didn't get a job. And we all know that kids usually are not job motivated, they don't have the skills, etc. But they actually advocate, meaning the probation department, to put them in jail. So alternative sentencing in Massachusetts would be good, if we could get that thought, involved in this process. Thank you.
Well, I don't think you had a question, but just to address.
I apologize.
No,
I didn't have a question. I wanted to make a statement.
No, that's fine. I was going to
Right.
address some of, just a comment on what you said is there are way too many people entering into the system, and then the people who do enter into the system, we're not handling them appropriately. And I think at least I may be naive, but on the positive side, I think the public is with us on this. I think the public looks at the system and thinks it's not working, and that there's too much money being wasted, that there are too many people who are in the system to start, and the people that are in the system, we're not treating the way they should be treated. In other words, they're reoffending, and that it's the system's fault that they're reoffending, and that the system and government isn't doing enough to help them so that they don't reoffend.
I just also think that the work that you all are doing and have been doing needs to be highlighted in a manner so that the public can really get behind you and begin to command and demand that these things be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was curious about the research and the justification for the mixed model of defense counsel. It seems to me we've heard about how important it is to have a culture of strong advocates, and the one thing you would not have with the private bar stepping in and handling so many cases is a culture necessarily of client-centered representation. So I find it a little bit disturbing to think that that's the preferred model. Seems to me, from what Steve Singer and what I've seen in public defender offices across the country, that you need to have people supporting each other who do this work day in and day out, who are completely up to speed on what's happening in the courts, and not people taking cases because they get an hourly flat fee or have whatever motivation. So, curious.
No, that's a good point. I think some of the thinking behind the benefits of a mixed delivery system is that it helps you to control the caseloads of the staff attorneys. So if you have caseload limits, that you have a vibrant, effective private bar that can step in and also handle the cases. And you can't just have a mixed delivery system without having performance guidelines and oversight of the private bar. You raise a good point that there's definitely a benefit to having staff attorneys who are in the courts day in and day out, and who that's how they make their living. But you certainly can have, and we have, many effective private attorneys who, although it might be only a portion of their practice, they're just as committed, they're just as, a number of our private attorneys do this work full-time, and they're not getting rich, but they're just as committed, just as dedicated. But you're right, you have to make sure you have an infrastructure in place to ensure that the private attorneys are doing the job that they need to be doing.
You want to address that before I go ahead?
Yes, Dawn, I understand your concern about this, but I would have to say that as a person who does a lot of the training in Massachusetts, that the county bar advocate programs who are subcontract with CPCS and oversee the private bar work really hard at establishing that culture within that group. And there is a strong, really vibrant identity in the private bar in Massachusetts about the value of their work, their commitment to indigent defense. They share with us that feeling of being overlooked and neglected and not having the means that they need sometimes to do the work we need to do for our individual clients. And like everywhere, in every system, there are people who are superlatively great and there are people who are terrible. But with oversight and meaningful training, you hopefully weed out the people who are not doing the job well. But it is a constant battle and a constant effort to support the culture of excellence in indigent defense against the factors that have been so eloquently spoken about during the morning here.
I want to mention one other benefit of, which I think was involved in the ABA's original thinking about this, which is that if the private bar is engaged in public defense themselves and not remotely just watching it, then they're a better, stronger ally for the defenders in getting adequate resources. But I think I think your point is really well taken, and in many other states it would be even more well taken. But in Massachusetts, you have, in effect, and this is from my observation and listening to my colleagues over the past 30 years, that the defender is actually setting the culture for the assigned counsel by organizing the qualifications and the training and the oversight of them. That's not true in a lot of other places that have a lot of assigned counsel involved. And so in my sense is that Massachusetts is a kind of model for that. In fact, I asked Ms. Bennett to come and talk at a conference some years ago about how she did it, because I wanted people to understand that. So I think that in a sense, you have the defender setting the culture for the private bar.
Thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking these fabulous panelists.